I'll
You will it?
yes, okay.
You'll do it?
That's it.
have it.
Okay, no, it's fine. It's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Very great. Thank you. I always end up here.
This I got from today. Did you got this?
I'm going to speak from here. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Hudson Institute, we welcome you to our conference on Brazil. The Brazilian people went to the polls yesterday, and as you know, they elected by a wide margin Jair Bolsonaro as their new president. He promised much, and expectations are high by those who supported him. Those who did not support him hope for a pragmatic approach, though much worry and doubt are being expressed today. On his agenda should be tackling the rising crime numbers, cleaning up a much tainted public administration after the corruption scandals and a renewal of regional leadership. Overall, we hope for pragmatism and consensus building by Bolsonaro and his team. Boa sorte. Huh? I had the immense honor to work as part of numerous IMF missions with the governing team back in 1964. To my young eyes, Brazil shone with vastness and energy, which we hope is recaptured soon. To discuss the scope of the change in this election, we have assembled a fantastic team of panelists whose details you can find in the programs. At the end, after all speakers have concluded their presentations, we will have a question and comment space for you to interact with them. I wish to thank our Director of Public Events, Sean Kelly, for his help and guidance. And needless to say, to John Walters, the guiding hand in the difficult task entailed in these endeavors. With anything else, I turn the mic to... You want to speak from there or from here? You can do it from there.
I'm happy here. Good. Well, thank you all, and thank you, Ambassador Darrenblum, for the invitation. It's a big day in Brazil, and I think for all of us who are concerned and hope for the best for Brazil. As many of you know, yesterday Jair Bolsonaro was elected in the second round. Ambassador Darrenblum asked me just to say a little bit about how the electoral system works, and then I'll get into my basic comments. But with regard to the electoral system, it's a two-round electoral system for the presidency, an open list proportional representation system for the Chamber of Deputies, and 2/3 of the Senate, which was elected in the first round of voting. So there were votes across all of the federal offices, and then also for governors. And so this was a very important election nationwide that really changed the political system as we know it. But of course, every one of those elections has its own rules, and therefore they have to be discussed somewhat separately. But as the first person to speak, let me just try to clear some of the thicket and start off by saying I think that this was very much an anti-system election. As most of you know, Brazil has been through 5 years of a triple crisis. It's an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a legal crisis associated with the Lava Jato scheme. And the most clear outcome of the election that has taken place in the 2 rounds in October was the fragmentation of the political system. So if you think about the Brazilian political system, it started with 16 parties in 2002. And as of yesterday, there are going, well, actually as of the first round, there are going to be 30 parties represented in the Chamber of Deputies. The 3 largest parties in 2014, the last major election in Brazil, held 161 of the 513 seats. And as of yesterday, the 3 largest parties have fallen to 145 seats. So this is a very important election in beginning to weaken the largest of the parties. I think the biggest loser was the PSDB. For those of you who remember Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the reformist president of the 1990s, this is Cardoso's party. Not only did the party not do as well as it had done in previous elections, but its leading figure today is João Doria. Doria aligns himself very closely to Bolsonaro. He's sort of a populist, TV show host. He has publicly associated himself with the term Bolsodoria, meaning that he would like to be both Doria and Bolsonaro. And so the PSDB, which had been the party of economic stabilization, the party of economic reform in the 1990s, I think has lost a lot of that cachet. Its presidential candidate, Geraldo Alckmin, the 4-time governor of Sao Paulo, won less than 5% of the electorate in the first round, despite enormous financial advantages. And he couldn't even win his hometown. So this is, I think, a major blow to the PSDB, in part because the corruption scandal hit the party as much as it had hit the Workers' Party. The second major loser, I would argue, is the PT itself. And there are people on the op-ed pages, and I'm seeing Mark taking copious notes here. He may contest this. But I think there are people saying, well, the PT nonetheless has the largest party in Congress now. It'll be the largest party in the fractious Congress. They did fairly well. They got 45% of the vote, even though they had a weak candidate who was named 1 month out from the election itself. But I would argue that they are a weakened party. And they're weakened because although they obtained 45% of those who voted, and I'll speak about that 45% number in a moment, they were unable, and I would argue unwilling, to reach out to create a broader democratic coalition. And part of the reason for that is because the party itself has failed to engage in any self-criticism, whether it's over Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, whether it's regarding the Lava Jato scandal, which hit the party very strong, or whether it's to recognize the PT's own mistakes that led to the policy switch of 2014 when Dilma Rousseff was elected, saying she was going to continue a certain form of developmentalist policy, and very quickly switched to what she had criticized in her opponent, essentially neoliberal policies. Or whether it's to recognize the recession that began on her watch, or again, Lava Jato. So Haddad, the PT's candidate, is a very nice guy, soft-spoken, seems very affable. But I think it's ironic and a sign of the times that his rejection rate was, depending on the pollster, 10 to 20% higher than Bolsonaro, who is, very hard right, representative of a social conservatism, representative of a hearkening back to, sort of saudades, that is, a wish to return to the authoritarianism of the military regime. So those are the 2 big losers. I think that it's also important to point out that although Bolsonaro got about 58 million votes, Haddad got about 47 million votes. The third largest vote came for those who voted for nobody. So abstentions, null, and void votes were 42 million against Haddad's 47 million. So this is, I think very, very significant. Bolsonaro has, I think, managed to unify what my colleague Tim Power has referred to as the three rights in Brazil. The first right is those who hearken back to the military regime. The second right is the evangelical social conservative right. And then the third, and this is where we're not quite sure what Bolsonaro is committed to, but time will tell, and that's the economic right, the people who would like to see, quote unquote, neoliberal reform. So I think the big question going forward now is, how does that coalition hold up? If you add up, as I did this morning, and I have to consult my table here, but if you add up the core base of support for Bolsonaro in Congress, the core base of support for him in the lower house is 15%. But when you add on some of these other center and center-right parties who might be willing to support his platform, that gets you to close to 69%. And under the Brazilian political system, to engage in constitutional reform, you need 60%. So he, I think, will be able to put together a tenuous coalition that can engage in some of the reform that's needed, and especially those constitutional reforms. But it is a very tenuous coalition, partly because Bolsonaro himself is not, doesn't seem to have converted fully to the economic platform that he ran on. He has allowed his economic spokesman, Paulo Guedes, a neoliberal, quote unquote neoliberal, to go out there and say, you know, we're going to engage in pension reform, we're going to privatize, we are going to reduce the size of the state. And yet, at strategic moments, Bolsonaro has walked back those statements. And you know, for much of the last month of the campaign, Guedes himself was extraordinarily silent. And we're not quite sure whether he was silenced or whether he went into hiding or whether he was kept strategically out of the way. So I'll just conclude in the last minute here with what I think we're likely to see in the first 6 months of a Bolsonaro presidency. I expect on the economic front, we're going to see some sorting through of who Bolsonaro wants to be. And this could include privatization. This could include pension reform if he is ambitious. I think much of the rest of the economic platform, labor reform, tax reform, central bank independence, may need to wait. But, you know, Bolsonaro may be able, with Guedes' help, to pull together one or two major reforms in that regard. The second issue, and this is, I think, central to Bolsonaro, which is public security. And the irony is Bolsonaro campaigned as the public security, the law and order candidate, but a president in Brazil has very few tools at their disposal to actually conduct public security reforms. Most public security is a state affair. So what might he do here? I think some symbolic measures are possible, like changing the age at which minors can be convicted as adults, perhaps changing the treatment given to social movements, such as the landless movement. There's been some talk about including them in the anti-terror law. But there is very little, aside from legislative statutory changes, that a president can do. And indeed, most cases of federal intervention in the states, federal intervention in Brazil is a formal mechanism. If the president engages in federal intervention in the states, his constitutional amendment reform process is put on hold. And so there's a real trade-off there for a president who wants to undertake reform. The final area, and I think it's important to raise because it was so central to the narrative of the election, is corruption and anti-corruption. And Bolsonaro used some very incendiary rhetoric, especially in the waning weeks of the campaign, talking about how he would get rid of the corrupt, and particularly the corrupt members of the PT. But when you look at his platform, the only concrete thing that's in the platform related to anti-corruption reform is a desire to see the 10 measures against corruption that were put forth about 3 years ago taken up by Congress once again. And Congress rejected those measures. Those measures, that was contested by Bolsonaro's son, and the High Court sent those measures back to Congress, and Congress sat on them. And the reason for that is Congress is likely to suffer if many of those reforms are passed. About, according to my count, about 29% of sitting congressmen between 2002 and 2014 were actually under indictment or under investigation. So they're not likely to want to see these reforms prosper. So I think there's going to be a tug of war going on here between the coalition that Bolsonaro is going to need to govern with and many of his campaign promises on anti-corruption. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador for the invitation. This is really nice. I feel honored to be here. And my talk will be a little bit different, very different from what Matthew just said, in terms of he focused more on the institutional changes and on the electoral politics. And I told the ambassador that I would be more interested in speaking of, as a former journalist, of the international coverage of the elections, which bothered me a lot. I thought that, first of all, I thought that this year would be a better year for Brazil in terms of options of candidates. I was hopeful that somebody more toward the center. We have many options from the center that could have done really well, and unfortunately turned out not to be the case. And until early this year, I was very, as many of you are now, very concerned about Bolsonaro, very afraid of a Bolsonaro victory. But it just happens that I have a lot of family from Brazil still, and many of them in Rio, which has been the ground zero for all the corruption scandals. And my relatives urged me to take a second look on Bolsonaro and the coverage. They didn't say specifically about the coverage, but just to take a second look of Bolsonaro. So what I did, I must have watched from 15 to 20 hours of video of Bolsonaro throughout his life. At the end, I was even dreaming about him after so much. And it was full exposure, throughout his career as a politician. And at the end, the conclusion that I took of all that exposure, that he's just rude and rough, and he expressed himself in the worst possible way, even when he's trying to do the right thing. Okay, and I'll give you one example, and that's the example that I even wrote about it. Is that when something that is very talked about, an incident that happened in 2003 that took place of a horrific crime committed by two guys, but one was an adult and the other one was 16 years old, and it was the killing of this couple, right? And so they killed the couple, they killed the man first. I'm not going to get into the details because it's too gruesome, but it's a case of rape followed by murder followed by rape. Okay, and so he was defending the reduction of my criminal responsibility age from 18 to 16, and he was in Congress giving an interview outside of chamber, but giving an interview to a radio station. And at some point, this congresswoman just interfere in interview and start attacking Bolsonaro for his defense of the reduction of age from 18 to 16, right? And then they start arguing, and at some point, and she said, he's just a child, the guy who committed the crime, the 16-year-old. And he said, to provoke her, that if he's just such a child, why don't you hire him to be your daughter's driver, personal driver? And that she got really mad, and she called him a rapist, right? And then he answers, no, I'm not a rapist, and I would never rape you because you're too ugly to be raped, okay? So in all these events, so even when he's in the right side of the debate, he managed to offend the victim, right? The victim. And he's like, his whole life has been like that, you know? And I can cite, you know, if you can ask about the many cases, like about the torture, right? And he was talking in the contest, because in the 1990s, especially in Rio and Sao Paulo, was a wave of kidnappings, like what they have in Colombia for a long time during the cartels. And he was talking about what you do when you get somebody, a suspect, that you know that is holding somebody in captivity, and that person is being threatened to be killed. What do you do in order to get information of that person? He said, you know, you have to, even if you have to torture, you need to do it, right? To get information to save somebody's life who's been kidnapped in captivity, right? And he's full of this very harsh and controversial language, and he foolishly puts himself into trouble, even when he's defending, as in terms of policy, the right side of the debate, I believe. So clearly he's not the ideal. He's not a candidate. He's not Prince Charming, right? But that's what we have. People compare him a lot with Donald Trump. I don't think it's a right comparison in the sense that he wasn't campaigning against the Democrats and Obama's party. He was campaigning against the Workers' Party that has very mixed history, right? And on one hand, you have a lot of good people who worked for the Workers' Party who have done very incredible things. But on the other hand, they have groups within the Workers' Party that act like an organized crime group, in my view. One thing that just happened that came out last week that I didn't know was that when President Temer was setting the transitional team for whoever would be elected, he said that he wanted to do something very different from what he got, right? Because when Dilma was impeached and Temer was her vice president, right? So when she was removed from office, and when Temer and his team took office, what they found in the administration, her team just erased crucial government files from the computers. They erased all the computers, very important computers, documents, important documents, government documents that was just thrown on the floor, furniture that was moved, everything just to jeopardize what they believe his government, but actually the country, right? And so I think that the best. I don't want to go over and over about what the Workers' Party, but I know somebody who had the opportunity to work very closely with Lula as president when he was president, and then later Dilma, and this person talks very fondly of Lula, saying that he was a terrific administrator. They could come and talk to him about policy. He would listen quietly, and at the end, that the person would explain. He would just ask how would that policy would be possible to take place, and guide who to ask for help in terms of people in Congress. So he was just a terrific guy. But on the other hand, so you have close to him, and then the expression that this person used, it felt like his government was like this truck full of carrying beers, right? And suddenly you have an accident, and you have everybody after to get the beers from the road, and that's how people were in his government. Except that's taxpayers' money, right? And the stealing, and he went along with that just to please everybody, not only people from the Workers' Party, but from all allied parties, and to keep himself in power. I know that my colleagues here, they wouldn't agree with me, but I personally felt relieved that Bolsonaro won. I think that Brazil needs to have alternation of power. The PT has been in power for so long, since 2003. He, in fact, is still in power because Temer was the vice candidate of Dilma. And if you think that the state has we have about 20,000 political appointments people are working in the state machine, they're still PT people, right? And we need to have, one of the promises that the Bolsonaro is doing is to eliminate as much as possible those appointments. If you just have an idea, the Brazilian economy is about $2 trillion in size, and here in the U.S. almost $20 trillion in size. And here in the U.S. we have about 8,000 appointments, political appointments that every president elected that has at its disposal. And in Brazil we have 20,000 appointments. Like, the state is really big. And my hope that he will be able to, his team is going to be able to be successful in reducing the size of the state, which they are promising. Just a few things that I want to address that Matt said, that in terms of security, although it's true that the public security is mostly the mandate at the state level, you do have the military and the federal police, which are the two institutions in Brazil that have some of the highest regard by Brazilians. They can do a lot to help with the illicit traffic of weapons and drugs. My hope is that the so-called war on drugs would leave the communities, especially the favelas, and move to the borders as it is here, because I think that would be safer for people in the urban centers, that you have that greater control of the borders, and you would avoid that clash that's constant between police and population in these areas. So I think that there is a room for that, and I hope that they take they use it. As for what's come, I think for the greatest danger is just the greatest task and challenge is to be able to manage expectations. That people's expectations are really high, and although there was a major cleansing in Congress, many of the politicians who have been involved in corruption, they were not elected. That was really a huge political renovation, thanks to the movement, the anti-corruption movement that Bolsonaro. The lady, for example, in São Paulo that got the highest votes, Janaína Pascoal, she was one of the writers of the impeachment, right? She's the most elected congressman, the representative for the state of São Paulo. And so there is hope. In the sense of these are new people with very little experience, but at least there was the cleansing that people wanted, and for the first time it actually took place when Brazil officially moved from dictatorship to democracy. Many of the politicians during dictatorship were there, and in my view at that time, I said, I shouldn't be that concerned because these people are just going to die away and we're going to have a renovation. It's just problem that never happened because they elect their children, their grandchildren, like everybody in the family, but the family is still there, right? And what happened, this election was really remarkable in terms of actually being able to remove these families that were there for decades. Right. I think that's for now. That's what I'll be happy to answer the question you might have.
Yeah, we'll leave all the questions for the end of the three presentations. Mark.
Great. Thanks, Ambassador, and to the Hudson Institute. And definitely want to make my remarks brief so we can hear from all of you and your questions and comments about the Brazilian election. But I have to say that I think that Brazilian democracy worked very well yesterday and during the first round voting. We had a very respectable, legitimate vote casting process that allowed for what might be expected after a three-pronged crisis described by Matthew earlier. That is to say, a political realignment. Brazil's what I call the compounding crisis, you could call it what you want, but it was a historic crisis, and someone had to be held responsible. Now, of course, the pilot in the cockpit would always be held first responsible, and that would be the Workers' Party and the prior presidents, Lula and Dilma Rousseff. But there's plenty of Brazilian actors and political parties in that cockpit, and some have, as Matthew mentioned, really lost authority to govern, and that would be the Tucanos of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the PSDB, with the exception of the new governor of São Paulo, Doria, who has, I call him a human wind speed and direction monitor, because this guy is a marketing pro and will go where the wind takes him. 4 years from now, we'd be talking about his new social democratic enlightenment, for crying out loud, depending if it works at the ballot box. But that's the way democracy should work, and it's worked quite well in Brazil. I think we can say that this election was a critical election in political science terms. It allowed for the political realignment from a social democratic center of gravity in Brasilia to what I've referred to in my writing as a conservative nationalist center or right wing or what have you. Matthew touched upon some of the dimensions of the political realignment, based on kind of a celebration of the military and law enforcement, the social conservatism associated with evangelical Pentecostalism in Brazil, and also kind of this kind of new old neoliberal approach to the resolution of Brazil's outstanding fiscal and economic problems. I work with a lot of different clients in Brazil, aside from being an academic. In the past year, I've been called a fascist by my friends in the Workers' Party and a communist by Bolsonaro's, in particular Jair's son, Carlos, who's a city councilman in Rio de Janeiro. So I guess that's where I really want to be in terms of being able to analyze policy formation and political risk for my clients. And right now, in the past couple of years, I've been working a lot with the cotton growers in Brazil and agribusiness, and also oil and gas, the oil and gas value chain, doing policy analysis and political risk. So on that, on those two equations, both those value chains would have preferred Alckmin, the PSDB candidate, former governor of São Paulo, the kind of trustworthy public administrator with a kind of a market-friendly approach to public policy. But the second choice was Bolsonaro, especially as contrasted with either Lula or Haddad or Marina Silva or Ciro Gomes, who came in third in the balloting in the first round. So they went with their, early, not too early, but agribusiness in July, August, settled with Bolsonaro. And then later on, as people saw that Alckmin couldn't get through that threshold of what I called 9%, to be a viable candidate, and actually landed at, just under 5%. Sometime in September, most business leaders in Brazil began to align themselves with Bolsonaro, anticipating Alckmin's failure to get past the goalposts in the first round. So what we have is a political realignment that both Monica and Matthew have mentioned. We're going to see a whole big, renovation, new faces in the Brazilian Congress. And many of these individuals, whether they come from Bolsonaro's party, the Social Liberal Party, excuse the name of the party, it has nothing to do with social liberal thinking, but a lot of these people have had no significant public policy making experience or public administration experience, with some exceptions. We're going to have a lot of that. We've seen a lot of the advisors that we suspect are going to have ministerial appointments or agency appointments, have some distinguished careers, but have not been in public administration for some time. Now I'm talking about Matthew's wheelhouse in terms of public administration. But we have a political realignment, which we would expect a lot of new faces. But this particular political realignment, in a sense, almost expresses the personal attributes of its leader, Jair Bolsonaro, who's now become elected president. Jair, I'd love to have a pizza and beer with him, and hopefully I'll be able to do that sometime. He get over his son's animosity towards me. But he is uniquely unprepared to be president of Brazil. He's had 27 years in Congress and has done really nothing for his constituents in Rio de Janeiro. And when we look at negotiations and ratification, I look at elections as a contract negotiator, which I've spent a lot of time doing, as kind of negotiations and a ratification vote. Jair doesn't have much to negotiate except for crisis, that he is, in a sense, the anti-crisis candidate. He's the anti-establishment, anti-workers party, but anti-other parties associated with Brazil as well. So he is uniquely unprepared. I think his incoming executive administration is mixed. It's kind of marbled between people that have had some distinguishing public administration or at least business experiences, and others that we're going to shake our head and go, I wonder if they're going to be able to really cut it in 12 to 18 months. And that's what we're looking at, 12 to 18 months. There's not going to be any honeymoon. They've got to get to the fiscal reforms. And we're going to see 12, 18 months whether this floats or not. But in Congress, like our own Congress just down the street, we have so many new people that really have never had any experience making sausage. And, just the technique of kind of negotiation and language building for bills and legislative projects, it takes a lot of skill. And if you're not experienced with that, and you've never been around it, and you've basically been elected with a lot of bombast, you're not in a great position to begin those kinds of negotiations. So Matthew's right. Jair has a kind of a slim majority in the lower house, and it looks like, close to a majority in the Senate, but we'll have to see how that plays out. He's going to need some really skilled negotiators in his cockpit to carry out the negotiations with Congress to get the kinds of things done that need to be done. So what I've done with my clients and what I shared with my readers in last Friday's post in the London School of Economics Latin American blog were 5 country risks that I think are associated not just with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, but with the political realignment, the new faces in Congress, and so forth. And I think they start out, as the ambassador mentioned, with high expectations. As a negotiator, the first thing you do with your constituents is try to level down those expectations. And in fact, the last political realignment in Brazil in 2002, when former President Lula was finally elected after 3 or 4 tries, he wrote a letter to the Brazilian people with the express motivation of kind of leveling the expectations. Like, let's not get overboard, right? We're not going to conduct a socialist revolution here. We're just going to feed people and pay our contracts, pay our debts. So Jair, in his kind of populist style, hasn't gotten to the hard work of leveling his expectations. And that's what he needs to do right now in the coming months before putting that presidential slash onto his shoulder. He needs to bring down the expectations because, as Matthew mentioned, 2 of really the stellar issues that propelled his candidacy and that Monica spoke directly to, crime and corruption, these are difficult policy issues in Brazil. They're not going to be just solved by reducing the penal age to 16. In fact, that may even complicate matters in ways that are unintended. But the expectations is a country risk because they've set up Bolsonaro voters, 57 million, to have fairly high expectations about the possibilities in a country that has limited possibilities right now. The second is the violence. We have seen since 2009 kind of a growing pattern of increasing homicides. And right now it's distinct. I've been to Brazil twice this month. I've spent, since July, probably half my time in Brazil. And while I didn't have to duck a bullet, I was aware that bullets were flying. And what we know, if you're a policy wonk like I am, or Matthew or Monica, oftentimes I go to Harvard University's Institute of Injury Control Studies. They study bullets. Every time you add a gun and add a bullet, expect more accidents and suicides and murders. So right now we already know, some of my colleagues on the business side are already showing me where they're going to buy their first handgun in Brazil. We already know that sales are going to start to ramp up. Congress has already started to seriously study legislation to ease the limits on gun ownership, gun sales, gun possession. What I suspect is that, yes, I think we're going to get a bump. It depends whether that bump turns into a trend, especially with respect to what we call lost bullets in Brazil. And some of these will just be accidents. We already had a child, I believe, died last night after a lost bullet in celebration of the victory came down. That's very common. In 2017, there were over 5,000 lost bullet accidents in the city of Rio de Janeiro alone. Some of them fatalities, but not, most of them not, but serious injuries and so forth. Also, we have the specter of some political violence. Now, usually during an election, a campaign, you're going to get some street action. We see it here in the United States. We expect it in Brazil. All democracies have this, and we have to contain it. What we want to see now is that to go away after elections, and that will be an important risk, is whether that street violence increases or decreases. It doesn't matter who starts the fight. It just matters whether that violence increases, because that will challenge, as Matthew pointed out, the state law enforcement authorities, the military police in particular, who are responsible to keep the violence off the street. So that's a risk that we're looking at right now. Also, the political stability. Any realignment is going to call into question the stability of governance, and that begins with Congress, but it really ends with Jair Bolsonaro. Can he keep this plane kind of, in a decent direction? Now, we've had 4 years of democratic governance with a lot of turbulence, right? We've had the impeachment. We had 2 very important votes in Congress to protect the sitting president from corruption allegations made by the Attorney General that would have been sent to the Supreme Court for a hearing, and the same majority that impeached Dilma saved Temer from trials in the Supreme Court. Jair was clever. He voted against the sitting president so that he could continue his branding of the anti-corruption candidate. So he's a smart guy that way, I think. But we're in for some turbulence, and it depends whether he can calm that or whether this, party fragmentation that Matthew mentioned, more and more parties, more difficulty doing the log rolling, to negotiate vote trades and so forth, and also more eyes, as Monica mentioned, more eyes on them about corruption. It's easy. It used to be easy to buy votes in the Brazilian Congress. Now it's difficult, and that's going to slow down the kind of log rolling, the negotiations to pass difficult legislation like the Social Security reform. Oh yeah, the fiscal failure. It doesn't matter what Bolsonaro does, even if he passes a Social Security reform at the federal level, the fiscal crisis is so bad, that might not be enough. Because the federal government is also responsible for state government accounts. And we have 3 fairly large states, all of which he won. Rio Grande do Sul, Minas Gerais, Rio in particular, and some other states that are undergoing a fiscal crisis that helps to explain in part why they can't curb violence, because they've taken money out of their criminal intelligence units. They have less people and less resources on the street to fight crime. And what we know is that the fiscal crisis has really emasculated even the low capability of the state civilian police to investigate crimes. We know that, 7 or 8% of Brazilian homicides are even investigated, nominally. So the fiscal crisis is out there. Guedes, the incoming Minister of Finance, is probably most attuned in trying to establish expectation levels that mean this. We have to do a Social Security reform, and we have to cut the budget. And he said he wants to zero out the budget deficit in 12 months. I don't think he should have said that, but the guy the guy's boss just won the election, so he's entitled to a couple days of bombast, but then he's got to reel it in, And then lastly, and something, I started saying, hey, this is the way democracy looks and should look in Brazil or any other democratic country. But we still have that specter of a constitutional crisis based in large measure by Bolsonaro's prior statements, and also something that I think all of us have maybe not analyzed sufficiently, and that is to say that the reason that we have corruption and crime in Brazil in large measure that goes undetected is that the law enforcement agencies themselves are corrupt. Now, don't put that on camera. The military police in states like Minas Gerais and Rio in particular, these are very large states, have a problem with corruption inside their own institutions that are related to drug trafficking, related to homicides, and this is going to be very difficult to root out. Why? Because Bolsonaro's core constituency is law enforcement and the armed forces. Many in the law enforcement agencies support Bolsonaro not for the right reasons, but that he would be their patron and protect them from investigation and prosecution under the law. So these kinds of elements create a specter of a constitutional crisis. We have to, monitor and see. We're going to see human rights abuses by the law enforcement agencies. This is a constant in Brazil. What we want to see is whether public authorities like the public ministry, like the federal police, like the Attorney General's office, can effectively investigate corruption within law enforcement itself. To me, that's the trigger to moving Brazil forward in terms of corruption and crime. If Jair Bolsonaro is unable to do that, in 27 months, people will be calling for his head. And I think he's got a short time, maybe 2 years, to show some real results without trampling the Constitution. And that means going at elements of his own political base. And I think that's the most disturbing part of the political realignment is the state-level law enforcement agencies. That's the one that I'm looking at in particular. Thanks.
Okay. I have a question. Monica, whatever happened to Dilma and her movement?
What do you mean? Her campaign to Senate?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because the polls were giving her such a strong lead for the Senate in Minas Gerais, and there were 2 seats available, and she got in 4th place, right? And nobody knows how to explain how come she has such a strong, definite lead to get at least 1 seat, and she misses both seats. So she's out of the game for now.
This mass of people that you have in the favelas and in other areas, not only in Rio, but in other big cities, how do they play out in terms of the polls? Who is against or who is in favor of a certain candidate?
I think it wasn't, it's hard to identify cleavages, like social cleavage, who vote for whom, right? It was more like of a across the board, like from the poor to the wealthier, and from all religions. Matthew talked about evangelicals, but it was really people from all religions who voted for Bolsonaro. And one thing that I liked, I think he started really well with his speech victory speech yesterday. It was very conciliatory. Yes, and in terms of reinforcing his support for democracy, for liberty, right? And by the way, Haddad never officially conceived. He just had a speech of yesterday, but he didn't call Bolsonaro. He didn't mention Bolsonaro by name. I mean, he implied, right, when he said, but it's not something that you would expect. Marina called Bolsonaro when he won, and the other candidates, but Haddad never did that. So his support was across the board, across religions. It wasn't, although there is a strong element of social conservatives, but I think it was across the board. I just want to clarify something that Mark said. When you talk about military police, it has nothing to do with the military, right? It's the name military. It has the name military police because it resembles the ranking system, right? Resembles that of a military, but it's a completely different institution. And that institution that it's mirrored of corruption case, you know. And the military police actually it's a very well-respected, one of the top, most respected institutions in the country, the military and the federal police. So just one thing that I want to clarify.
Okay. You have any question for your colleagues?
I would be interested, Matthew, because I see a clear cleavage in this political realignment, and I think the measure that stands out the most to me is that you've got about 5,400 municipalities in Brazil, and they split pretty much. The richest half went with Bolsonaro, and the poorest half went with Haddad and the Workers' Party. Why is that? Because the poorest towns in Brazil are reliant on federal and state transfers, just as they are here in the United States. And if you look at that, it's pretty much right down the middle on that median city or town in Brazil. And that, if you look at that measure, you can see, if you're doing the political calculus of policy formation, if Bolsonaro wants to increase his support, and he has a big, strong mandate, maybe he doesn't want to, but a lot of incoming presidents kind of want to expand a little bit. One thing is he wouldn't want to curtail those federal transfers, but the fiscal crisis will inevitably mean that he will have to curtail. And so in 4 years, we might see that needle go past the halfway point and favor another social democratic candidate, whether it's the Workers' Party or another stereotypical Brazilian social democrat. So if I was advising Bolsonaro, I'd be saying, look, that is your biggest challenge right there. Because elections are organized at the city level in Brazil, and you've got maybe 3 years to at least preserve that dichotomy or actually bite into it a bit. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, I think he's betting on economic recovery. But that may not play out in some of Brazil's poorer, smaller cities.
Yeah, when I talk about cleavage, I was talking about within urban centers, right? But there is a clear cleavage in the Northeast, where the poorest areas in the country, and then that's what people said. Bolsonaro in the first round hit a wall, like the Northeast, which has been a region historically vulnerable to assistantialism. During the dictatorship, that's the region that used to vote the most for the most conservative parties in the past because of a lot of assistantialism. And the South, Southeast, even Center-West in the country, they tend to be more progressive. But with the Bolsa Familia, it kind of switched. It has been the area that's been more in support of the Workers' Party as opposed to the other parts of the country. In terms of the fiscal transfer, Bolsa Familia itself doesn't cost that much, right? It's about 0.5% of the GDP, right? And it's I'm not here to defend Bolsonaro, but he promised to keep that. And I don't think that's an issue, right? I think the concern that he has, that his government has, is that you have an entrance door, but you don't have an exit door to this social programs. And actually, last week I was talking with a student, a Brazilian student in my class, and she was telling about her experience, and which is backed by data, that she used to do work in favelas in São Paulo, and her experience working with the communities was the one that prompted her to be very negative about Bolsa Família, which I think should be kept. But what she said was that you have kids that have, I think they hit the end of eligibility by the time that they turn 15, because it's when the education ends. But then you see a lot of young girls having children right away. Like the rate of teen pregnancy has increased a lot. And what she was saying that so you go from the coverage from your own education, and then you already moved on having children. This is in very poor, not middle class, but in more poor communities. And that's what prompted her this is an unintended outcome. There is a huge need for some form of income transfer in a country like Brazil, right? And that's the challenge if you're a policymaker. How can you design policies that are effective as Bolsa Família, but without these unintended outcomes? Because nobody would think that once you end your years of being beneficiary of Bolsa Família, you would have kids have an incentive to have children right away, right? I don't think anybody who designed expected that, but that has happened. And the trick part now and the challenge is how you can give the right incentives so that the program can be strengthened and even expanded if necessary, right?
Matt, you have any, Matt?
Yeah, I can.
Do you have any questions for your?
Sure. I guess the question I have, and maybe Mark, you talked about the constitutional issue, but I mean, I was reading Celso Barros had a very interesting piece in Folha this morning where he said, there's an issue. The fact that we're discussing the stability of Brazilian democracy is a symptom of the fact that Brazilian democracy is not as strong as we think it should be. And Bolsonaro certainly has raised all sorts of fears about the strength of checks and balances in Brazil and who would control the president if he engages in some of his vitriol, his bombast, and then goes further and perhaps, tries to undercut institutions in some way. And so since you did bring up the constitutional issue, I just put you sort of on the spot to say, what you're feeling about that. I didn't sense in your talk, you talked about stability, you talked about the constitutional issue, but I didn't sense a real fear about the stability of Brazilian democracy institutionally going forward.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I put it as a risk, certainly. And I think a smart executive that has a policy agenda that's well defined is going to run up to those constitutional limits. We saw that with some of our own presidents, beloved and those that maybe aren't so beloved here in the United States. I think that, if Jair invites some smart people, in particular constitutional lawyers, into his camp, they will keep him from going way over those limits. I think I see more that constitutional crisis coming out of state institutions, in particular the military police, as Monica said. They're not attached to the armed forces, but unlike our uniformed police here in the United States, they abide by an internal disciplinary code and justice system. So they can't be tried like some of the police officers here in the United States are tried in criminal courts. That's where I'm looking at where a constitutional crisis would begin. If you have some rampaging military police going way beyond, and we've got a track record of that here in Brazil, it's going to create a lot of instability because the federal courts will have to determine whether those law enforcement agencies that are somewhat autonomous from the criminal code in Brazil are allowed to continue in that autonomous way. And that's where I see some of the aspects of constitutional crisis coming about. I mean, Jair is going to have his hands busy trying to govern the country. He would be poorly advised to try to stoke up a constitutional crises, I think, at the federal level. But yeah, we have to keep our eyes on it because of some of the outlandish statements he said about doing an auto golpe, meaning closing down Congress and things of this sort. But his party came in second place in the lower house. It grew from 5 deputies to 52. So I think he's learning the arts of democracy on the move, and is probably happy with what he has in Congress right now. So probably it's the federal judiciary that will have to draw the lines of his executive maneuvers. And while they have been tested in the last couple years, and I have my own criticisms, including of Judge Moro in Curitiba, I think on the aggregate, the federal court system will probably respond in a similar way in terms of, kind of laying down the line occasionally. Why, if you're president, why always get in a fight with the judiciary system? I don't see where Jair wins anything with that. But if he does, he will begin to lose support and create more political instability in Congress as Congress people peel off because they want to get to the next election, right? I mean, democracy is a lot about opportunism. And many of these younger Congress people are getting in the door for the first time. They have ambition and they want to run for office in 2 years at the municipal level or 4 years at the federal level.
Okay. Let's welcome questions, and we'll begin on the right. Hi,
Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in DC. 2 questions. When you talked about the future of civil-military relations in Brazil, I was wondering if you can talk more about Bolsonaro's VP, Hamilton Mourão, retired Army General. What will his role be in the future of civil-military relations in Brazil? Could he be the patron that you were referring to? That if Bolsonaro cannot do it, maybe he will be the one doing it. And the other question will be about fake news. There were a lot of articles and meetings in DC talking about the effect of fake news in Brazilian elections. I think the New York Times had an article like 2 weeks ago calling fake news, saying that fake news is poisoning Brazilian politics. So how effective were fake news in the elections, if at all? Thank you.
Want to collect some questions, or we want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the question about Bolsonaro's vice presidential partner, Hamilton Mourão, is a really good one, because if you're going to try to impeach Bolsonaro, this is a good reason not to. For the center and the center left, certainly Mourão looks even worse than Bolsonaro himself. I think a central question that's running through my mind and has been this whole electoral cycle is how much is Bolsonaro running the show and how much is he being controlled? And, we saw this in the United States as well. But I was thinking as you were answering the last question that I asked you, Mark, he has the benefit, and this kind of goes to your second question about social media. Bolsonaro has played a double game here. Right, where he lets certain people speak for him, and when it convenes, when it goes in his favor, he lets it stand, and when it offends, he backs down. And so he lets Mourão speak for him, and then when Mourão says something that gets a little beyond the bounds, he discredits him. He says, no, he doesn't speak for me. And so Bolsonaro gets the bonus because his followers think, well, he believes what Mourão said. And he doesn't have the onus because he can say, I don't actually believe what Mourão said. And you see this over and over again. You see it with his son, Eduardo, his other son, Carlos. I mean, you see it with all of his sons. You see it with many of the people in his administration. And so that does take me to the issue of social media. I mean, this was the WhatsApp election in Brazil. There were accusations of campaign finance violations because some business people may have contributed to propagating news on social media. I saw some very frightening statistics that I'm afraid I can't replicate for you today about the number of social media news items that were false and discredited and yet believed by supporters on both sides. And they're very high indices of fake news that's being propagated and believed. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those are both great questions. I want to raise one issue, though, which is, and I realize that this isn't in direct response to what you're asking, but it goes to the point about how much Bolsonaro is controlling this and how much he is following this. But I think that there's a real trap for the opposition in Brazil going forward. And so when we think about the possibility of a constitutional crisis, I agree. Mark had some very, I think, insightful comments about the likelihood that constitutional crisis could come from the state level. I think it's very likely that we're going to see an increase in police violence in particular because the police is already deadly in Brazil, and I think Bolsonaro has opened up the possibility of a much more violent police. But I think that there's also the possibility of a federal crisis, and it's not clear to me how it comes about, but there are many traps here. One trap is that Bolsonaro has managed to label all opposition as PT, as Workers' Party. And so he may continue to do this, to lump in anybody who criticizes his measures as being part of this leftist cabal. The second, I think, trap here is that many of the reforms that Bolsonaro will need to undertake involve privileges. And those privileges sometimes will be the privileges of the institutions that are supposed to provide checks and balances. So Mark mentioned prosecutors, and Mark also mentioned the courts at the federal level. The courts and prosecutors in Brazil are the most expensive courts and prosecutorial bodies in the hemisphere, by a long shot, like multiples of anywhere else. And so it does make sense to reduce their privileges. There are excessive privileges in Brazil for those bodies. But what's going to happen if Bolsonaro does that? I think rightfully, many people will say he's trying to cut back on checks and balances. And so there's a trap here, or a tension, that I don't quite see how it ends in a good way. Anyway.
Let me just say one thing about fake news, too. I mean, I participated in my first election. I think when I was 10 years old. We tried to repeal a dry county legislation here in the United States. We wanted to build a restaurant, you know. It was still a dry, thing. Fake news has been around in elections forever. What's unique about the Brazilian is the pace, right? I mean, a narrative can change from 9 a.m. in the morning to 10 a.m. We're used to it here in the United States. But Brazilians got used to it real quick in the last couple months with WhatsApp and so forth. And it's kind of a boomerang. Hey, so Jair, he has, spent, since 2010 perfecting the arts of social media. These same arts can come by real quick and take his head off. If he gets himself into trouble, he doesn't have, he's got 57 million, but a lot of them voted for him with some questions, right, Monica? What's Up can come right back to drive his popularity down, well below what we'd like to see a stable, legitimate executive have, somewhere, around 50% at least. So that's a thing I also would be looking at, is that same vehicle, the pace of it. If something bad happens with Bolsonaro, boy, that can really drive down his popularity. And that overall is not good for Brazil. Brazil needs a popular, stable executive to do the kind of work that's needed to get that country back on a plane of economic recovery with stable social inclusion.
Very good. Could you give us your name and affiliation, please?
Carlos Ayum, Bank of Central American Economic Integration. Does anybody know what is the share of social welfare programs as a share of the budget and as a share of GDP? And if you, possibly if you could include the, not just Bolsa Familia, but also public education and public health.
So at the federal level, I'm going to give you rough estimates.
And
Yeah.
I could just add one thing. What are the chances that Brazil could once again attain the rates of economic growth that it attained in the 1970s when it averaged about 8% annual growth?
Yeah. So maybe I don't want to go into specifics on the exact spending levels, but Monica mentioned correctly that Bolsa Familia is about 0.5% of GDP. The pension system is also a social expenditure, and it's closer to 5% of GDP, just to give you a sense. The thing that's a little complicated is, in terms of the federal budget, most of the social transfers for health and for education are counted before the federal budget is actually put into place, because they happen immediately. Revenue comes in and is transferred down to the states and municipalities. So I don't have a figure for that, but I want to say it's close to 9%. So it's, you know, these are very large numbers, and the dirty secret of Brazilian presidentialism, where you have a very strong president, is that the discretionary budget that the president controls is about 5% of GDP. It's pretty small in the grand total of federal spending. And then things like Bolsa Familia actually come out of that. So out of that discretionary spending. So there's not a lot of spending left over at the end of the day for the president to actually change policy direction. And then there are constitutional mandates that mean that, for example, health and education, he has no ability to change. He can't touch it.
It's earmarked.
Yeah. So then the question about growth is a great one. If you look back from 1985, with the restoration of democracy, to the present, Brazil has lost ground in terms of per capita GDP by comparison to every country in the hemisphere except for two, Mexico and Venezuela.
Maybe also just to add on the growth side, I think the thing to do is study Lula's 2003 fiscal adjustment, right? But then in 2004, he caught the commodity price boom. We're unlike, I mean, commodities are creeping up, but we're unlikely to see the kind of boom we saw from 2004 to 2009 in Brazil. So Bolsonaro, you know, he has very few policy instruments to really increase economic growth. He could lower taxation, and that might trigger investment, but then he loses it on the fiscal side. He's going to have to borrow more money and inch up, and that's going to, you know, disturb interest rates and so forth. So he's got fewer and fewer levers that even Lula had in 2003, when, if you remember, in 2002, the Workers' Party elected 91 deputies, one of the highest totals, and then started to lose deputies to, you know, splinter factions as he deepened, you know, the Social Security reform and the fiscal adjustment. So, you know, I believe that Guedes, the future finance minister, is probably studying that 2003 fiscal adjustment and the sequence and how you do that given even fewer tools in the toolbox.
So 8% out of the question.
You know, yeah,
Well, 1970s is import substitution industrialization, and that's off the table, I believe.
One thing one way of they can address is the micro area, the microeconomic, in terms of business environment. I think that's something that at the executive level, he would have the chance, his government would have the chance to make a difference, right? Dealing with things of solvency, desbureaucratization, helping small and medium-sized business, making it easier to open, less costly to open. So they have signaled that they want to address that just to boost entrepreneurial ship in Brazil. So that's something that might be very positive.
Okay. The gentleman here in the first row.
My name's Timothy Towell, 30 years in the Foreign Service. I have a question about crime, drugs, and the military police. I was consul in Porto Alegre, Florianopolis, 72 to 74, General Geisel. In my last assignment, 88 to 91, U.S. ambassador in Paraguay, a neighbor, a very important neighbor of Brazil. You mentioned in discussing crime and drugs and the wonderful military police and their discipline and behavior, that they might focus less on the favelas in the big cities and more on the borders. Well, in the OAS event a couple of weeks ago, somebody was talking about Ciudad del Este, Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, the worst, most corrupt city in the hemisphere. And then he said, no, the most corrupt city in the world. If you send these wonderful military police to the border of my favorite country, Paraguay, I was ambassador when we sent President Stroessner over to watch Shusha on TV. Won't that be chaos in the heartland of this great hemisphere of ours when those wonderful police go over and mess around with the wonderful people in those three countries? Active commercial people with drugs and banking. That's called money laundering.
I would disagree a little bit with your premise, because I think that the federal police, the Brazilian federal police, actually is doing a job that's being well recognized even in the U.S., especially after the September 9/11 attacks, because a lot of the attention was brought to that area because of the terrorism training that took place and fundraising that took place in that area, that was taking place in that area to fund terrorist groups. So the U.S. has invested a lot in that area and has worked closely with the federal police in Brazil. And I'm not talking about the local police, but at least the federal police, I think that they are doing. People even here in the U.S. respect their work. I don't know what you guys hear about it, but that's what the information I have, right? And there has been a lot of coordination between FBI and the federal police in Brazil, and in all sorts of areas, in illegal trafficking of weapons, and that's something that I think it's positive to have that. If they can boost that coordination, that would be very helpful.
Thank you.
Maybe
Yes.
can I just comment on that? In
Very
2000,
shortly, because I want to give time
Okay.
to our guests.
in 2004, Lula and the Workers' Party had put a criminal justice reform on the agenda. They didn't do anything with it. And I think that says a lot, that the Workers' Party, in both Lula and Dilma's terms, found out that that was a Pandora's box that they did not want to open. I'm talking about the state level, civil and military police authorities. Politicians, right, left, and center have pretty much wanted to stay away from that because they know that it's part of the problem, but one that's very tricky to resolve.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Me or? Okay. I'm Herman Baum with the National Association for Objectivity in Science. And my wife is from Brazil, and she and most of her relatives in Brazil are very strong supporters of Mr. Bolsonaro. And my wife is always gets upset when the U.S. media refers to Mr. Bolsonaro as far right. She finds his positions very common sense, and he stands for strong family values. So she doesn't understand why is he referred to as far right. And I believe Mr. Taylor, I think you've referred to him as hard right. Could you give a definition of
I'll own up to it, yeah.
hard right and why you classify Mr. Bolsonaro as hard right?
Sure. So, I mean, just to give you, I think I can give you 3 examples. One for each of the rights that I described. So, on the social right, you know, one of his most famous phrases, Monica talked about the rape story, but there's another one where he said, you know, I'm very glad that my son isn't gay. If he were gay, I would kill him.
He said he would rather have a dead son than that.
Okay,
That's a different.
I'd rather. Okay, fair,
they're both horrible,
fair.
but he wouldn't kill the son. He would rather have a dad, which is a horrible dead son than a gay son. But it's a horrible thing to say. I mean, I'll give you that.
Yeah. On the sort of harking back to the authoritarian regime, he has frequently said that his hero is Colonel Brilhante
General.
Ustra. What?
Colonel.
Colonel, who was one of the people who's alleged to have been one of the most important torturers under the military regime. And then, you know, on economic matters, it's a little harder to say because I think he is more of a corporatist than he is really a converted neoliberal. But on the spectrum of economic policy in Brazil, where you've had, for the last 20 years, you've had the Social Democrats, Cardoso's party, who engaged in some important reform, but, for example, refused to privatize the 5 largest state-owned enterprises in Brazil because you wouldn't do that, right? That's, it sort of went against the developmentalist ethos in Brazil. So he instead has Paulo Guedes as his advisor, and Paulo Guedes is very much a, you know, convicted neoliberal, and I use that term. It's sort of the term of art in Brazil, and I realize it's a term that doesn't have much definition. But I guess, you know, between the PSDB and the PT for the last 20 years, you've been going between the center left and the left, and Bolsonaro on economic affairs is definitely to the right of them, which is why I said hard right. But I think on those 3 dimensions of what it means to be right, there's nobody to the right of him that I can think of in Brazil. As a politician, he's sort of at the far right of the spectrum.
Sir?
About no affiliation, retired. I have an issue. You talked earlier about the teen pregnancies and how that fuels the crime and violence there. Has Jair or by Bolsonaro get indication of what his positions are regarding family planning, birth control, or, you know, choice on abortion, or is he? I assume he favors the similar abortion laws they have in Honduras or El Salvador, where a young woman or girl can be imprisoned for life even if she miscarries a fetus conceived by rape. Or does he support ignorance in the name of abstinence on birth control, or does he support effective family planning and birth control to reduce instead of reproduce the type of poverty which leads to the type of crime that he says he hates?
I mean, yeah, I know. I don't think he's against family planning, right? I don't think that of any politician in Brazil that would be successful defending abstinence. You know, that's something that it just doesn't happen in Brazil. Okay, but he's as most Brazilians. So I think socially, talking about the right, he's more aligned to where most Brazilians are in terms of values, right? Because Brazilians, people don't think that way. They're actually pretty conservative, right? They're pretty religious. Not necessarily affiliated with a specific religion, but they're pretty religious. They're against abortion. They're against gay marriage. So he is aligned with the rest of the country in that. He's a reflection of the country, you know, but I don't think that. So he's against abortion, but he would go for family planning. Who support family planning?
Let me just comment, because I think, you know, he has backed up on some of his statements regarding the gay population. The last couple of weeks, he's made it a point to appear with well-known gay personalities and so forth. He's trying to kind of walk that back a little bit, but clearly his statements are offensive to a lot of Brazilians, maybe a majority, maybe not, and so forth. But I think on the abortion question, you know, he is kind of following suit with social conservatives here in the United States, except there's a lot of blinking in Brazil. That is to say that the same urban middle class that has embraced Bolsonaro, at least in the last 4 to 6 weeks, they're the ones that disproportionately use abortion services. Now, some of those services technically may or may not be legal, but it's likely that they would, even if abortion was made more difficult legally in Brazil, it's more likely that some of his own supporters would be the highest users of illegal or questionable abortion services and so forth. Whereas poor Brazilians, part of Brazil that voted for Haddad, they don't have the resources to get abortion on demand. And I think that's where there's a kind of a blinking system in Brazil that, yeah, we say a lot of things for elections, but when it really comes down to policy, we're willing to look the other way for stability's sake.
But we just keep with the status quo, right? Because
Yeah,
abortion is
it's
already
likely.
prohibited
Yeah.
in Brazil. Although anybody who has money can have abortion, and you're not going to have police raiding abortion places, clinics, but it's already illegal, and I think he wouldn't even try to touch that.
Okay. What is the name? I'm sorry.
Author and independent scholar. You mentioned the constitutional crisis as a problem currently in Brazil. It leads me to ask about the 1988 Constitution. My understanding is that that Constitution bent over backwards to avoid strong executive like vested in the military dictatorship. And in addition, and I may be wrong about this, amendments to the Constitution are passed by the Congress. They do not go to the people like they do in the United States. So my question is, are some of the turbulence, especially the sharp swing from the PT to the now to the conservative side, in part due to some weakness or inefficiency in the Constitution that was drafted and accepted and went into effect in 1988?
Yeah. Is it okay?
Yeah, go ahead. That's yours. That's good.
So I think that I disagree a little bit. I think that the Brazilian Constitution, it started out, the first draft was a very progressive draft, and then the so-called Centrão parties, the centrist parties, came in and rewrote it. And so the first draft was actually written by the Social Democrats largely, the Tucanos, the Cardoso's party and some of his allies. And they wrote something that looked quasi-parliamentary. And then the Centrão, which is the traditional centrist parties who are now the swing vote in Congress, came in and basically said, no, the president needs more power. And so the Brazilian president actually has a fair amount of power that makes him the first among peers in his relationship with Congress. And I think it's no mistake, Mark mentioned that the PSL, Bolsonaro's party, has 52 congressmen now in the lower house. Well, that's only 10% of Congress. So he'll have 10% of Congress, but I bet you by March, he'll have 70% in his coalition. And that's because the president, and this has always happened, the president always is able, at least initially, to pull together a governing coalition because he's got appointments that he can make. He has decree powers that he can use. He has some very strong controls over the legislative agenda. He has the budget. I mean, there are a lot of sort of magnetic forces that draw congressmen to the president. I think where the constitutional threat comes from is that when the president loses Congress, typically the president has lost power. And so this happened with Collor and the impeachment of Collor, and it happened again in 2016 when Dilma lost the support of Congress and she was impeached. So I think that that's 2 of 7, and it's an important threat that's hanging over the head of whoever's in the presidency.
It's interesting when
Excuse me.
Brazilian Congress people come to the U.S., they like to talk about divided government in the United States because they really don't understand it. It doesn't exist in Brazil.
Okay. Unfortunately, I would like to sit here all afternoon and enjoy myself with your questions and their answers and vice versa. But I just was signaled by the ones who manage the institution that it's been enough.
Ambassador, can I say just last 1 minute? Just 1 minute.
Okay.
Because one thing that I think that Bolsonaro is just a polarizing thing and it's such a magnet for all attention. I just want to call attention that if you have on one hand General Mourão as the vice president for Bolsonaro, we would have Manuela Dávila, who is somebody from the Communist Party. Okay, and I think that there was a lot of concern about that in terms of security of property rights I think in Communist Party it's okay to be in Congress being represented. I'm all for pluralism, but once you put somebody, if something happened to Haddad, you would have a communist as a president of Brazil. Plus, Haddad himself, although he is by all means a very likable person, is super educated, calm. His tenure as a mayor of São Paulo was a disaster. He left São Paulo with less than a two-digit approval. He got elected because of Lula, and he wasn't able to get reelected. And he's left the São Paulo. And if you ask all Paulistanos, with a reputation of being lazy and super inefficient. So these are the options that we had in this election. Okay, and I just want to highlight, we don't talk so much on the other side for understandable reasons, but I think that's something that we need to address as well.
Thank you. We thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon, and we thank our panel, distinguished and very active, and I would like to propose that we end the session with a round of applause for our Muy bien.
Hey, Ambassador, good to see you.